Our political commentators today are Gareth Hughes and Brigitte Morten. Kia ora koroa.
Morena.
Gareth is the Director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa and a former Green MP, no longer a member of any political party. Brigitte Morten is a Director with public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie, a former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government, a National Party member and volunteers for the party's deputy leader during campaigns, Nicola Willis, during campaigns. Okay, the conflicting polls, sort of conflicting. The results were in conflict, but actually there was some similarities between the RNZ poll and the TVNZ poll last week. What did you learn from it, Gareth?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, the RNZ Reid had the opposition bloc, mean government if we had an election tomorrow, and the One New Zealand had the government bloc. So, yeah, you can see contradicting messages, but actually I think there's quite an interesting tale that can be told from the poll. What we know is it's very tight, and this has kind of been consistent for a while. No matter how you shuffle the decks, week by week, month by month, it's coming up with really similar results. It's going to come down to some crucial few percentage differences at the next election, some big questions. You know, New Zealand First survival is critical for National if they want to retake the government benches. We know that Te Pāti Māori consistently has a bit of an overhang. What will that play with the final numbers? But what we can see is, there was no post-budget bounce for the government, for National. They actually saw a drop. And the Talbot Mills poll showed actually the worst budget response since 1996. And another part of this tale is the persistent weakness of Labour and National. Together, they're polling at about 60-65%. This is really different to previous elections, 81% in the 2017 election, 76% in the 2020 election. This kind of seems to be a locked-in feature. Likewise, the last time we had a poll that had a two-party governing arrangement was all the way back in February last year. So we're locked into these two competing blocks where a few percentage points is going to be the crucial difference. There's lots of other things I think we can dive into, but those are sort of my top level takes.
Yeah, I'm a bit reluctant to kind of talk about left and right blocks because I think at the moment still Labour doesn't have a pathway to power. They've still got, we saw those comments from Winston Peters, as his outgoing Deputy Prime Minister interviews saying that he wouldn't go with a Hipkins-led Labour Party. Te Pāti Māori, and I think we'll dive into it a bit later, are not demonstrating that they could be a party of government at the moment, and I think that would be really difficult. So I think what Gareth is sort of focusing on in terms of what's happening with the two major parties is probably a better place for us to look at the moment. Those sort of low support results for those two major parties is pretty consistent with what we're seeing overseas, which has been that mistrust in the major parties. You're seeing throughout the world that people, their trust in government has gone down, and those centre parties are really aligned with that sort of rhetoric. So I don't think that's surprising. I think that's probably true that it's going to be very difficult for any party to get back up to that sort of 40% that we might have thought the governing party would need. So I think that the polls showed that consistently. Obviously, that sort of consistency and that bit of bounce for New Zealand First was quite interesting. They've gone up quite consistently since the election and sitting quite nicely around 8-9. That would be a much more comfortable place for them to go going into the next election than sort of teetering on that 5% threshold. I think, to me, the two things I always think polling is always the most interesting. Really interesting to see that I think Te Pāti Māori and the penalty that was handed out to them, that there was a really clear majority for that level of penalty for a 3-week suspension, which I think definitely surprised me to have that level of support for that, and I think probably surprised a lot of people that that was the sort of I suppose ill feeling towards Te Pāti Māori, which goes further to my sort of thoughts that Labour doesn't have that pathway to government at the moment because they don't have Te Pāti Māori as a potential government partner.
Yeah, it's an interesting question there because a lot of the debate has been around the relativity of that punishment compared to anyone else in the history of Parliament. Not necessarily what you'd be focused on if you were answering a question. It's like a visceral response, but what it does indicate is that people weren't impressed. A lot of people weren't impressed by the action that was undertaken and how it was undertaken. Anything else out of the reaction? You mentioned the budget reaction, of course. I would say, though, Gareth, given that it was a pretty negative reaction to the budget itself, that didn't translate to a massive drop for National necessarily.
One perspective is they could have expected worse, given all the headlines over the pay equity and that basically framed the lead up to the budget and sort of dominated the budget discourse as well. But I'm looking at the track all the way back to 1996 that Talbot Mills produced, this is outstanding in the sense that for the first time in that period, all three measures that they poll on are negative for the budget, and it's the worst one that's got an overall net negative. Budget, this is one of the few big key opportunities we have in our political system where they can really reset the narrative, really grab the country's attention, particularly in this time when not that many people are paying attention to politics. And again, that wasn't the great story for the government.
Does arguing a negative fail to get you poll results? I mean, the argument is we've got to get these books sorted. We've got to get this structural deficit sorted. Is that something that just does not register a positive response in a poll?
Yeah,
Bridget?
I think it's the polling is asking, if who would you vote for this week? And it's very much they probably would have looked at last week's budget and went, well, my household is not any better off this week because of the budget last week. I do kind of just reset that narrative a little bit about the budget being the sort of set piece. I think that the relevance of the budget has gone down and down. The sort of 24-hour news cycle, the fact that we have many more announcements, etc. But I also think that sometimes demonstrates the difference between the left and the right, because the left often demonstrate through big spending and big numbers what they're doing for the country. The budget is a big deal. It is about setting that political narrative. But for the right, we're actually much more about getting out of the way, smaller government, moving regulation. It's actually about that legislation and the regulation that they're doing or taking away than it is about how much they're spending.
Just quickly before we come on to Parliament's debate over the Te Pāti Māori MP suspension, where does this leave Labour and its messaging? This combination of the polls suggesting it will need Te Pāti Māori on any sort of recent polls to form a coalition. Again, we're how many months out? We're less than 18 months out now. Again, it has to walk a line between saying we would be a viable government together, but also confronting some pretty challenging issues being raised by others, saying how would this work?
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to point out the National have this challenge as well with ACT. They've dropped in this poll as well. They're fronting some pretty unpopular policies like Brooke Van Velden on the pay equity, on the regulatory standards bill, on the health and safety stuff. So this is the dynamic both blocs have effectively, a sort of more extreme member on the side that's kind of come to define the larger party. But I think what we're seeing is the key message from the Labour Te Pāti Māori relationship is they don't want a war. That was the main headline from Willie Jackson's interview over the weekend. We saw John Tamahiri speak to the Labour caucus after the budget. They worked together on a couple of press releases and a few issues this term, but they still don't have that relationship for the governing relationship. And in fact, at the moment, it's a one-way street. Labour, I think, is sensitive. They know that they need to appeal to national voters to change the government. Te Pāti Māori, kind of in a co-opetition relationship with Labour, is looking at boosting their vote, and Labour has been ruling out Te Pāti Māori policies like constitutional reform, etc. So it's a one-way relationship. They need to stitch it up before the election.
Did you just say co-opetition?
Co-opetition.
Okay.
They're cooperating, but they're in competition as well.
I've deduced it, thank you. Bridget?
I think it's a little bit... It's not correct to say that ACT and Te Pāti Māori are in the same boat in terms of those sort of extreme parliamentary parties at the moment. ACT has demonstrated for 90% of the time that they have been actually a very solid coalition partner. And in fact, when you have seen the agree to disagree, it's actually run out pretty well between the parties. It's a very stable coalition. The behaviour you're seeing from Te Pāti Māori is quite something beyond that. I mean, frankly, bringing a noose to the House on Thursday and the ugliness of that debate demonstrates that they have no interest in being part of what is the normal standards and conventions of the House and of a coalition. And whereas you actually seen from ACT that they have used the parliamentary processes. I also think in terms of, Gareth's reference to sort of pay equity and workplace relations, particularly workplace relations, I think that those are votes that Labour would have had no matter what. I think there is a lot of businesses out there that think the balance has gone too far one way, that WorkSafe is not a place that actually demonstrates, with guidance and actually trying to make things safer, instead with penalisation and bureaucracy. So I think that actually that's not going to be something that's seen as an extreme. I think that's only seen as extreme, frankly, by the unions.
Let's just touch finally on this Te Pāti Māori suspension vote, which finally happened. The debate happened. I listened to a lot of it. I know a lot of people said it was sort of chaotic and angry and everything else. I actually heard some really thoughtful speeches, particularly from some of the backbenchers and particularly from some of the Labour speakers, and not just exclusively them. It was a very mixed and interesting tack that people took on this issue. But what's the counterfactual, Bridget? If Te Pāti Māori, having done that in Pākehā, that went around the world, right? There's no questioning the theatre of that and the impact.
Yeah, but
of
they
that.
can't vote.
If they had backed down and apologised, which is what the Privileges Committee membership or certain members of said everyone else did, and that's why things ended, they would not have flown with their base. Once that act had happened, were they not locked in?
Yes, but they could have done it more constructively. They could have gone to being turned up to the Parliamentary Committee in a bit more way, in the way that they were asked to turn up. They could have also, there was a real opportunity here in which we could have had more integration of tikanga into what is happening in Parliament and a little bit of a reset. I think there was a bit of an appetite for that within the House, and that would have seen as being more constructive. And then they could have got another win out of it. Yes, they've got the protest vote. That's not a problem. And I think you're right, that does well for them. It doesn't do well for a potential left-wing government.
One final observation out of the number of really good speeches I heard. One was Irena Williams talking about, and others have as well. She gave an excellent speech, actually, talking about the fact that the Privileges Committee, it's not supposed to be a government majority committee, and that this risks the politicisation. This risks you saying, if we want to shut that person down, we go to the Privileges Committee and we've got the numbers. Gareth?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why it's unprecedented, not only in the harshness of the punishment, unprecedented in the approach this committee has taken. Historically, there's been as close to consensus as you can get. In other cases, maybe it's been a single member who's normally the subject of the privileges complaint who's had a minority view, but they've managed to get a coalition of the parties around it, because this should be not a political committee, this should be a parliamentary committee with the public and the parliamentary interest, not political interest. When you've got such a narrow vote, it's a dangerous precedent that it could be seen to be abused in the future. And I think this is the tension. I could imagine a Helen Clark or a John Key with a bit of authority and mana actually cooling the tensions, actually focusing on healing the rift, bringing people together. I think Judith Collins particularly was a bit hot-headed with this, pushing through with such a razor-thin majority. I wonder if a different Prime Minister may have taken a different approach.
I can't help thinking that was the Prime Minister, in fact, whose tension with Tariana Turia led to the founding of the Māori Party. So she may have, but who knows?
But
It's a piece of history now, isn't it?
I do wonder if that polling result, though, you actually see a situation where both sides are perhaps seeing political advantage by elevating this, by raising it up. Te Pāti Māori have made a lot of running on it. They're getting a lot of attention. I think Adrian Ralphie's speech in the House, was another real bouquet.
Yeah, okay. There was some good stuff in there if you had it on in the background as I did while I was cooking. Okay. Bot versus Bot. Now, this came out of Guy Espina's interview with the ACT Party leader and now Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour over the regulatory standards legislation, which is now before a select committee, and the original assertion that a very high proportion, 95 or 99% or something, may have been sourced by bots. Now, Mr. Seymour later clarified and said, look, I'm talking about something we've seen emerging, which is these mass forms going out there. But it's a really interesting premise. Because what is a submission and what isn't a submission, and what is a submission that all submitters should read, and what is a submission that could be summarised for them. Fantastic article by Mark Delder on Newsroom recently. Are we going to end up with bots writing submissions and bots reading them? We're nowhere near that, but what are some of the things to be thought about out of this debate?
And of course, Mark was referring to the dead internet theory, where you've got bots talking to each other online without actual humans being involved.
Although they're still monetising and we're still paying them. But anyway, carry on.
Politically, though, clearly you see David Seymour is facing some pressure. There were 20,000 submissions to the Regulatory Standards Bill over summer to MB. This wasn't even a Parliamentary Select Committee submission. So there's genuine interest out there. These are real people concerned about it. I think he's trying to disparage it, and it's kind of the lowest form of political attack, just writing it off as bots or form submissions. This has been, I remember doing this in the early 2010s, organising campaigns to get ordinary citizens to have their view heard by the government, and I don't think it should be disparaged.
But how many now would be form submissions? And actually, simply enough, if it is a form submission, can you not take one as read if you are the MP?
And I think, having chaired a select committee, that's how they're treated, And maybe it's depending on the level of political heat. There's much higher number of form submissions in the contentious bills than the sort of more practical technical bills, and often they're read as one. So maybe the one form submission times 10,000 or 30,000.
Yeah, I think there's a large percentage, and if you look at that sort of 300,000 number on the Treaty Principles Bill, a large number of them were sort of form submissions. You just had to be on Instagram for 10 minutes to get, being told how to make a submission in 2 minutes. I think there's a little part of me as a nerdy politics lawyer that, thinks that people should be, if they're submitting on a bill, to understand the bill, and in 2 minutes you're clearly not reading the bill. So I do think there's a lot of people that submitted on bills, and this is not just the regulatory standards but on both sides, that do so because of what they're told that it contains necessarily than what it does actually contain. So I think it's ultimately, we have decided that the people that we want to make laws are our MPs. MPs have the ability, regardless of whether it's been read by a bot or summarised, to read every submission they want to read or not read any submissions. And I bet Gareth has come across MPs that have not read a single submission in a select committee process.
And you can tell who they are.
Yeah. And so I think that's ultimately what we've got that decision to make. So if you want people to pay attention, you've got to think about how you do those campaigns. Maybe this is a signal that actually mass generating submissions is actually not a good campaign tool to use anymore.
But also, we know in the sort of the real world of politics, these aren't sort of independent committees of experts weighing, on a select committee. Independent, these are political. Select committees are political creatures, and governments make decisions based on politics. And really, what these campaigns are also about is raising public profile, raising the debate, and public, mobilising supporters. This happens on both sides of the House. And I think, before, Brigitte, you said that you didn't think the ACT was as extreme as Te Pāti Māori. Remember, the ACT Party, their treaty bill has generated the largest protest in our country's history, the largest ever select committee submissions. Even if you don't look at the detail of the submissions, you can tell a big message of genuine mainstream public concern. I think the point, though, is that should AI be used to summarise submissions? I'm pretty open to that, but I don't think we should be humans shouldn't be reading individual submissions coming in. I think if you're submitting to Parliament, you should have an expectation. If you're making genuinely independent points, not a form submission, it's going to be read by a real human.
This is the challenge of AI all round, is that the risk is it becomes the default instead of helping sort out this from this, that it becomes the default. It's going to be the human that's the challenge here, who just can't be faffed. And one of this feeds into a wider issue about select committees. We've talked about this before. They're shorter, submission times are shorter, they get far less coverage, they're shorter in terms of submission time and also the length of time often to consider contributions. Select committees are where bad law can be made less bad, frankly, and I don't know what your opinion is, but it seems to me their role and the significance of their role and the time spent on getting things right has not been heading in the right direction for quite some time.
I think, to put it back on my sort of political nerd lawyer hat, we do a lot of submissions that look at the technical, that look at what does actually this section mean against this section, and if you define it this way, that is why people, I think, get technical experts to look at particular legislation. And we have seen real change because of that. I mean, you've got to, obviously if the bill is part of a coalition agreement, the bill's going through, so how can you make it better rather than trying to, say that you're going to completely defeat it, although, there has been some success of that. So I do think I'm weary of, saying that select committees have gone down and down in relevance. I actually don't think that is true, but I do think that we can increase the quality of submissions that are going in.
Not everyone can, frankly, hire a lawyer to do a technical analysis.
No, but it's not just a technical analysis, because often when I say technical experts, it can be someone that is at the local sports club that puts in, they look at the Incorporated Societies Act and they say, this would actually have this impact on our club.
That's
and that
another whole
resonates
story,
really well.
Okay. Look, the final point is you've got to have the select committee at all. Pay equal to anyone. Let's just not have one at all. All right. On the substantive, very quickly, the Regulatory Standards Bill, I don't know how much you want to go into this, Gareth, but, even the name is enough to turn the general public off. But there's a significant shift in terms of what is to be considered in the writing of legislation as part of this bill.
Oh, and I think, it might have a boring name, but people are aware of what's in it. And remember, for ACT, this is the fourth time trying to get this through. And, kudos to their persistence in pushing for it.
Over many decades. A couple of decades, I think.
But I think why people are concerned and the importance of it, this is almost like pseudo-constitutional or sort of systemic foundational legislation they're trying to amend. They're trying to use the Regulatory Standards Bill to affect every single regulation that passes through the system. This is why I mean it's sort of systemic. And they're trying to lock in a very particular view of what good lawmaking is. And what, an area I'm concerned about is the locking in of private property rights. Not that I'm against private property rights. It's that what this regime could lock in, any policy change in the future could then demand compensation, be it for the environment, be it for genuine public policy. I mean, there's a bit of a rich irony here that, minimal compensation for Māori over decades, the way it's been written, taking away property rights from Māori historically, wouldn't get, I'm all over the show on this point. It's the contradiction of act when it comes to private property for Māori versus the general public. There was an excellent article over the weekend as well pointing out that the reforms we've seen in the 80s or 90s wouldn't even be possible under this regime. So they're trying to lock in this current sort of neoliberal orthodoxy.
I think we would be really careful, though, as those words lock in, because it doesn't.
It's not constitutional.
It's not constitutional. It doesn't lock any parliament into anything.
The next government can change it.
The next government, because I think the basis of this, in which that we need better lawmaking processes and standards. I mean, you've just got to look, frankly, at the last term of Labour's government, where regulatory impact statements, very boring but very important to demonstrate actually the impact that laws have on people, completely just thrown out the window. They were just a waste of space if they were even done. I think trying to actually lock in some of those processes, which we've done multiple times, the Bill of Rights is one way. We have Bill of Rights reports. Treasury has to report up on certain things when we've got decisions going to Cabinet. I think it's part of that matrix, and any future government can come in and say, do you know what, I don't want what you've described as neoliberal principles. We could have a well-being set of principles, for instance.
Okay, super quickly, out of last week's story concerning the Prime Minister's press secretary and a personal scandal, I think would be the term we would use. Focus has now come to security vetting issues and the risk that someone in a position like that with access to quite privileged information is in a situation of handing their phones over to someone. What do you take away from this issue with respect to whether the security vetting processes have failed here, Bridget, or need looking at?
Look, I can only really go back to my time in the Beehive and the security process. The security checking was quite thorough. The ongoing education and reminding of what your obligations were and what things you should consider, it was basically non-existent. Maybe that's changed. That was sort of 10 years ago that I first had my sort of security check. And I hope it has, but by the sounds of it, it hasn't. Because from what we've heard, particularly anecdotally, that hasn't been happening.
So you have to continuously update if something has happened, say in your private life.
You've got a duty of disclosure.
Right.
So you've got a duty of disclosure on a range of things. The ones that we're particularly here is basically any activities that would make you susceptible to blackmail. This would be very clearly within that camp. And, I mean, you've also got a duty of disclosure, I think, for any former staffer to a politician. You spend your time trying to manage the politics, to not disclose to them that actually you've got a situation in which could cause them political embarrassment and derail the government of the day's business is just completely unprofessional.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Forbes should have disclosed it more than a year ago. I mean, it's curious how the police are sort of passing it from buck to buck, and no one seemed to know about it. Yet here we have a ministerial phone actually subject to a search warrant, and no one was informed. I think it's quite staggering. I do wonder if there should be a higher threshold when staff transitioning to the Prime Minister's office, because I understand the system is you have the initial check and then they don't check in for about 5 years.
Which is Bridget's point.
Which I think is true, it's outside the Beehive as well, because remember, these security checks are not just for people in the Beehive. There's a lot of people outside the Beehive that have access to a lot more confidential and sensitive information than anyone in the Beehive has access to in terms of staffers. So this is something I think that needs to be looked at across the board. I totally agree on the matter of police, though. This ridiculous, well, I wasn't the commissioner at the time, just scones all responsibility, and I think they really need to think about their processes.
Thanks both very much. Gareth Hughes, Brigitte Morten.